Joining us now is Spencer Dale, chief economist at BP. Spencer, let me first ask where they would look elsewhere for energy. Where else? What are the alternatives?
So, point number one, Matt, is although China's energy demand is slowing, in our report to growing about 1% a year, it's still a big market, and 1% growth of a big market is still a significant amount of energy. But in this year's report, we sort of suggest even bigger in terms of a growth market is going to be India, where economic growth is likely to continue to remain really quite strong over the next 20 years. And so India sort of becoming the world's largest growth market for energy.
So, good morning to you, Spencer.
Morning.
So that's the picture in terms of where the demand comes from. In terms of how big the demand is overall for the globe, how much have you considered the global trade disputes and how much that weighs on demand for growth? Or do you sort of look through that? Do you think it's transitory?
No, we have a sort of special scenario this year where we think about the impact that trade disputes could have. Sort of two big impacts. One is if the world just trades less, is less open, then that will tend to affect global economic growth, and that weaker global economic growth over time builds up, and that leads to weaker overall energy demand. Another point which I think is really important here is in this world of trade disputes, if you're a large Asian economy and you're importing lots of energy, you start to worry about the security of that energy. And so I think another thing which we may see is those economies start to prefer their own domestically produced energy rather than imported energy. So in this scenario where we look at someone like China, for example, they move away from oil and gas and move towards domestically produced renewable energy and coal.
So it speeds up an adoption of alternative energy sources?
Both. It speeds up the production of domestically produced energy. Some of that is renewable energy. If you're China, you're India, it's also an awful lot of coal as well.
I'm interested in the mix, Spencer, because, well, here in Germany, that's a changing picture, but it's changing slowly and it's difficult to find alternatives. So in China, for example, what's the breakdown of their energy supply? What do they get? How much do they get still from coal? How much comes from nuclear? How much comes from renewables?
So today, about 60% of China's energy comes from coal, so it's still massively coal dependent. They are trying to move away from coal as rapidly as they can. So in the sort of this, one of the scenarios we look at, that share gets down to around 45% of their energy by 2040. But to do that, they need to grow nearly every other fuel really rapidly. So massive growth in renewable energy, wind and solar, but also huge growth in nuclear energy. By 2040, nuclear energy in China is as much as a whole of the OECD put together in one of our scenarios, and also strong growth in natural gas. So China, big effort to move away from coal, but to do that, massive growth in more or less every other fuel.
Interesting to see. You have to make, of course, you have to make assumptions when you do these kind of forecasts, and you have to assume that governments take action around renewables, for example, at a similar pace to which they have already, and maybe that raises questions. But tell me about Paris goals and whether we get close to the goals set by the Paris Climate Accord based on your analysis, because it doesn't look promising.
No, so the analysis today, it sort of says in terms of the rough trajectory we're on at the moment, we are not on a trajectory consistent with meeting those Paris climate goals. To get on those Paris climate goals, we need carbon emissions to fall very substantially over the next 20 years, 40, 50%. The trajectory we think we're on at the moment, they continue to edge up. So one of the key messages from our report is we need to do far better in terms of climate.
So even if many of us in the West switch to electric vehicles and hybrids and the like, that's still not enough?
No, and the thing with electric vehicles is they're very important in terms of local air quality and local air pollution. You can put literally 1 billion vehicles on the road, electric cars on the road. You can power those purely by renewable energy, and it wouldn't move the dial in terms of carbon emissions. One of our key messages we keep saying in the inflation report, in the energy outlook, one of the key parts where you really got to make progress is the power sector. Decarbonise the power sector, and we need governments to really focus their efforts on there.
Spencer, do you have, when you look at missing the climate change goals, do you have a correlation between degrees Celsius and, GDP percentage point growth? I mean, how does that affect the economy directly?
No, so we don't get into that issue about the feedback from how a warming planet then made feedback onto GDP growth. I mean, I think that's there, but I don't think we really have the expertise to sort of get into that issue.